Tonight's episode is about medieval peasants, where famine wasn't some rare, unlucky event. No, for peasants, it was more like a lifestyle they didn't exactly sign up for. And a good harvest? Oh, that was just a delightful fairy tale to get your hopes up before reality slammed you in the face. So, buckle up for a deep dive into a world where surviving was the best anyone could hope for. Peasants were the low, droning note that played constantly in the background, uncelebrated, unnoticed, and very often underfoot. They were the backbone of feudal society, though no one seemed to realise this until their backs broke under the weight of ceaseless labour, impossible taxes, and general existential discomfort. To begin at the beginning, birth, one must appreciate the remarkable statistical unlikelihood of a medieval peasant making it into the world in one piece. Childbirth was less a medical event and more a divine gamble. Most births took place in cottages that doubled as kitchens, workshops, stables, and, in especially lucky cases, homes. The midwife, armed with little more than herbal teas and the sheer power of hope, did her best to usher new life into a world that was already well overbooked on suffering. Infancy was a particularly tricky time for survival, as it involved three key medieval threats: rats, disease, and gravity. If a child could survive the perilous drop from a poorly thatched loft, standard crib placement, the ever-curious mouthful of contaminated straw, and the myriad plagues running rampant through even the cleanest of dirt floors, they were considered hearty enough for life. Celebrations were minimal, partly because joy was seen as sinful, and partly because no one wanted to jinx it. Education in the modern sense wasn't part of a peasant's early life, or indeed any part of it. The only reading many peasants did was the landscape. Was that wheat, or weeds pretending to be wheat? Could that cloud be drought, or the Lord's steward in disguise? The alphabet was generally considered unnecessary knowledge unless you planned to write a complaint to God, in which case you were better off just screaming into the wind. Children were apprenticed early to dirt. By the age of 6, most knew how to carry buckets, collect eggs, and respectfully avoid eye contact with livestock larger than themselves. A select few might become village specialists, swineherds, beekeepers, or most prestigious of all, the person who knew how to thatch a roof without dying. Housing was minimalist, to put it kindly. The typical peasant hovel was constructed from wattle and daub, a combination of sticks, mud, and optimism. The floors were usually dirt, the walls were slightly wetter dirt, and the roof was straw that doubled as bedding for rats, birds, and occasionally people. If it rained, the ceiling dripped. If it didn't, the ceiling still dripped, for reasons no one understood. Furnishings were sparse: a three-legged stool, a single wooden spoon, and a bed that was less a mattress and more a suggestion. Everyone slept together, including the livestock, which made for warm winters and very confusing dreams. Privacy was a concept known only to nobility and cats. The diet was, shall we say, consistent. Pottage, a greyish stew of grains, water, and whatever else wasn't nailed down, was the centrepiece of most meals. Meat was rare, unless something had died recently, and even then it was shared with an enthusiasm that bordered on the religious. Turnips featured prominently, partly because they grew well in terrible soil, and partly because they were too ugly to be stolen. As for hygiene, there wasn't any. Bathing was considered either suspicious or downright dangerous, depending on the century. Soap was a luxury, and teeth were regarded as temporary tools. The average peasant cleaned themselves by standing near a smoky fire and hoping the smell of burning dung would cover their own. Lice were a fact of life, and scratching was the closest thing to a national pastime. Still, there were moments of joy. High days and holy days, which seemed to fall with a suspicious frequency whenever ploughing season began, offered opportunities for music, dance, and ale that made everything look slightly less muddy. These festivals were less about religious devotion and more about a temporary suspension of misery. The Maypole dance, for instance, served as a community bonding ritual and an excellent way to sprain an ankle. Marriage was another milestone, marked not by love, but by the merging of two families' debts. Dowries were negotiated in units of livestock, or how much bread the bride's mother could bake without crying. The ceremony itself was often performed on the church porch, partly because the church didn't want peasants tracking in manure, and partly because interior space was reserved for those who could read. Children followed quickly, too quickly in some cases, considering the gestation period, and the cycle began anew. Peasant families were large, not because they adored children, but because child labour was cheaper than oxen and almost as strong by age 10. Each child represented another pair of hands and another mouth, meaning prosperity and famine were always separated by a hair's breadth of weather. Time was marked not by clocks but by toil. Dawn meant work began. Dusk meant work paused briefly to eat and collapse. The calendar revolved around the agricultural cycle, which was itself dictated by forces far beyond human control. Rain, sun, pests, the whims of saints, and the ever-present threat of the Lord increasing rents because Mercury was in retrograde or his soup was cold. Social status among peasants was measured in very small increments. One might be marginally better off because they owned their own ox, or knew how to make shoes, or had once spoken directly to the reeve without vomiting from fear. But in general, peasants were united in a kind of grim egalitarianism. No one had much, and they all smelled the same. Relations with the local lord were characterized by the sort of mutual resentment typically reserved for uninvited dinner guests who also own your entire life. The lord demanded labour, rent, and unwavering deference. In return, he provided theoretical protection, an annual festival where he waved from a balcony, and a convenient scapegoat for every peasant misfortune, including bad weather and boils. Religion was a powerful force in peasant life, not so much because of spiritual enlightenment, but because hell sounded suspiciously like their current situation, and they'd rather not go somewhere worse. Priests served as moral guides, news sources, and unofficial tax collectors. Church services were conducted in Latin, which none of the peasants understood, but which they agreed sounded impressive, and therefore must be important. Despite it all, the toil, the illness, the indignity, peasants found ways to endure. They told stories, sang songs, and occasionally made jokes about the reeve that could only be whispered in barns. Resilience was not a choice, but a necessity. After all, one couldn't exactly quit being a peasant. There were no lateral moves in feudalism, and so From birth to death, usually between 30 and 40 if they were lucky or childless, the peasant life was one of constant effort and fleeting comfort. But even in the worst years, when crops failed, taxes rose, and one's best goat keeled over in the yard, they carried on. Why? Because someone had to. And then, just as the world began to settle into a rhythm of perpetual hardship and cabbage, along came a new menace. It didn't wear armour or carry a sword. It didn't demand rent or tithes. It simply arrived, on ships and rats and the stinking breath of fate. It was hunger, but not the garden variety kind. Not the regular gnawing emptiness a peasant was as familiar with as their own name. No, this was famine. A grand, sweeping absence of sustenance that made even the most optimistic turnip look like a distant dream. Which brings us to our next chapter. How to survive famine when your entire food strategy relies on guesswork, superstition, and one suspiciously thin cow. Famine is a lifestyle, not an emergency. Let's take a moment to talk about starvation, that ever-present companion of the medieval peasant. It wasn't so much a seasonal inconvenience as it was a constant state of being. Even in the good years, when crops grew in abundance, and your neighbour didn't cough up a lung every time he looked at the weather, the reality of not enough was a fact of life. If it wasn't the blight wiping out your wheat, it was the rats devouring your barley, or the Lord's increasingly extravagant taxes making it impossible to buy a sack of flour. And then, of course, there were the bad years. A drought could turn the most robust field of rye into a dusty memory. Or in a cruel twist of irony, a downpour could flood the very ground you had so painstakingly tilled, leaving you staring at your soggy crop as though it might somehow turn itself into a loaf of bread if you just believed hard enough. Alas, belief was no substitute for barley, and barley was no substitute for food. As a peasant, you learned to adjust your expectations downwards. While a knight might dream of land, a mansion, and perhaps a particularly nice sword, you, as a peasant, would be thrilled by a sack of oats that didn't look like it had been gnawed on by rodents. The possibility of actually eating until you were full was as mythical as the notion of owning a horse that wasn't also your work animal. When famine did strike, as it was wont to do with the grace of an angry bear, peasants had two primary strategies: denial and scavenging. Denial took the form of praying harder, hoping that if you just wished enough, the Lord might let you slide on your rent, or that some miraculous bounty of turnips would sprout from the dirt like a divine rebuke to bad weather. The reality, however, was more grim. If the famine lasted long enough, you would resort to the second strategy, scavenging. This involved going through every discarded vegetable peel, every scrap of mouldy bread, and any part of a goat that might still be recognisable as edible, in the hopes of surviving just one more day. At worst, you could always count on the mysterious and unappetizing delicacy known as pottage, a soup so thin and tasteless it could break a spirit without needing a word. Famine, in the medieval peasant's mind, was not an exceptional event. It was a lifestyle choice. It was the tax season of nature, unpleasant, unavoidable, and always happening at the worst possible time. The peasant's relationship with famine was akin to that of a dog and its fleas. They both didn't ask for it, and yet there they were, forever bound in a cycle of itching, scratching, and general misfortune. Unlike today, Where famine is often seen as an unfortunate anomaly to be managed or eradicated, medieval peasants had a much more pragmatic view. Famine was an eventuality, like winter, or the likelihood that someone would contract the plague after getting too close to a sick sheep. It wasn't that they wanted to starve, but they did, in a perverse way, expect it. In fact, they were so used to it that they didn't consider it a crisis when the crops failed, or the harvest yielded barely enough to feed the chickens, let alone themselves. To be a peasant was to live in a perpetual state of dietary emergency, and after a while you just stopped bothering to care. When the grain harvest failed, as it inevitably did, because nature had all the consistency of a bad cook, peasants would shrug, exchange mournful glances, and then proceed to try and scrape together whatever meagre scraps of food they could find. This wasn't a catastrophe. It was just another Tuesday. "Ah, the wheat has withered again," they would mutter. "Guess we'll have to make do with whatever the weeds leave behind." They would then proceed to eat weeds, which, you may note, weren't a great source of nutrition, but did provide excellent fibre. It was a balanced diet, in the same way that a plank of wood is a balanced dining table, as long as you didn't have to use it. The act of foraging for whatever food wasn't actively trying to kill them became a social event in itself. You could always count on the village to gather together when famine struck, not to share their collective woes, but to divide up the collective misery. It wasn't about feasting. No, that would be far too decadent. It was about surviving together. Everyone would put their heads together and figure out what was left to eat. Unfortunately, what was left often referred to things that had either been neglected, undercooked, or had been growing in suspiciously obscure places. A bit of mould on the bread? A few worms in the grain? These were mere character-building features of the medieval diet. So long as it was technically edible, it was fair game. Pottage, that greyish stew made of whatever you could scrounge from the earth, was the staple of this era. It wasn't food so much as a living metaphor for medieval suffering. It was the meal you could always count on to remind you that life had no intention of being kind. A proper pottage required a variety of ingredients, none of which were usually available when you needed them. There were the obvious essentials: water, oats, and a few root vegetables. But sometimes, if you were lucky, a rat might wander by and find its way into the pot, giving the dish a bit of extra protein. For the truly enterprising, the occasional bit of spoiled meat could be thrown in for good measure, though it was generally agreed that any meat not eaten within 2 days of being slaughtered had a slightly dubious reputation. And yet, despite all the adversity, famine, and despair, peasants somehow managed to endure. They were, by necessity, masters of not starving. If the crops failed, they would steal from the next village over. If their own chickens were too thin to lay eggs, they'd borrow from a neighbour and quietly hope they could pass the fowl off as their own. If the local lord's granary was well stocked, they'd perhaps find a way to borrow a sack of grain that would mysteriously find its way into their own humble abode. Theft, of course, was a delicate art. Too much pilfering, and you might find yourself in the stocks. Not enough. And you'd be left watching the harvest pass you by, starving all the while. It was a fine balance between making do and getting caught. A balancing act that made medieval peasants into the world's most pragmatic criminals. If you had a skill, It wasn't in making things. It was in knowing how to make the best of what was never yours. But it wasn't all foraging and thievery. Sometimes peasants were fortunate enough to experience a brief respite from the gnawing hunger in the form of a festival or a feast. And when they were truly lucky, these occasions were sponsored by the Lord, a generous gesture on his part, designed to remind peasants of their privilege while reminding them who was truly in charge. These events weren't about eating, they were about displaying the contrast between the abundance enjoyed by the Lord's household and the meagre crumbs the peasants were accustomed to. At a typical feast, the peasants were given leftovers, which usually meant whatever scraps the Lord had rejected or deemed unworthy of his royal palate. A bit of meat here, a little stale bread there, and maybe, just maybe, some mead that hadn't gone sour yet. It wasn't much, but the peasants could always count on one thing. The Lord would have no idea what it was like to eat something that wasn't deliberately disgusting. These feasts, of course, were part of a larger social contract, the kind that medieval peasants had no choice but to honour. The Lord provided a feast, and in exchange the peasants worked harder, prayed more fervently, and never, ever questioned their place in society. The Lord's generosity, which they may or may not have paid for with their own taxes, was an act of benevolence that helped the peasants see how much worse things could be. A little bit of starvation now seemed far less important when viewed against the backdrop of a grand, generous feast that reminded everyone of the intricate class structures that kept them in their place. Famine, in this context, wasn't something to be solved. It was something to be endured. The medieval peasant didn't expect prosperity. They expected the occasional miracle of survival. When the crop failed, they turned to their neighbours, their families, and their community to help each other muddle through. It wasn't that they didn't care about the hardship, they simply learned not to dwell on it too much. It was easier to endure famine when you accepted it as part of life's rich tapestry, alongside rats, lice, and the occasional plague. But it wasn't all starvation and debt. No, there was the occasional festive occasion, a good harvest festival, or a day off when the Lord decided to throw a feast and invite everyone, including the poor, as long as they didn't touch the meat, the ale, or the bread. These events, which sometimes coincided with a full moon or the Lord's birthday, the exact cause of their sporadic occurrence remains unclear, were opportunities for peasants to pretend that life was a bit less bleak. Of course, this was often done under the watchful eye of the Lord's guards, who were quick to remind you that if you were enjoying yourself too much, you were probably doing something wrong. And that's the crux of it. Famine wasn't an emergency. It wasn't even a tragedy in the grand scheme of things. It was simply the way the world worked. A minor inconvenience in the life of a peasant, right next to death, disease, and the constant threat of the Lord asking for more rent. There was always something worse on the horizon, so why worry about it? But there were other things to worry about, of course. Things like plagues, which would arrive inevitably to provide peasants with a nice, meaty distraction from their perennial food shortages. Lords, rents, and other minor inconveniences like starvation. When one considers the average medieval peasant's life, a few things become painfully clear. They worked too much, owned too little, and spent a remarkable portion of their existence praying for an early frost to kill the rats that ate their crops. But none of these indignities were as systematically embedded in the peasant experience as the feudal system itself. You could count on your crops failing, your pigs dying of mysterious causes, and your family's health deteriorating as quickly as your neighbours. But the one thing you could always depend on was that your lord, and by extension his tax collectors, would never let you forget who owned everything, including the very ground you were trying to plant your vegetables in. Let's start with the Lord, a title that, despite its best efforts, never quite conveyed the level of passive-aggressive cruelty it should have. The Lord, typically perched on some conveniently elevated piece of land, was the person who owned everything. The land, the crops, the animals, your sweat, possibly even your soul, though you could probably get that back if you found the right priest. As a peasant, your primary relationship with the Lord was one of contribution. You contributed labour, grain, livestock, or whatever else was currently in short supply, and in exchange, the Lord offered you the sort of protection that could be generously described as theoretical. Your day-to-day life was an endless series of obligations to this Lord, starting with the rent. Rent, in medieval terms, was less a payment for services rendered, and more a way for your Lord to ensure that you never had enough to live comfortably, which was, after all, the key to their power. The amount of rent you paid varied depending on how much land you worked, how many animals you owned, and how desperate you were. If you were especially fortunate, read unlucky, your rent might be paid in a percentage of your crop yield. This meant that the more successful your harvest was, the more likely you were to be miserable for having grown it. If you were really lucky, the Lord would demand rent in the form of a freshly slaughtered cow or pig, which, in turn, would ensure that you had to eat dirt for the next year, because that cow was probably your entire food supply. Let's not forget the tithe, that charming little fee you paid to the church, just in case you hadn't yet given away every vestige of your dignity. The church was, of course, the great benefactor of peasant suffering, offering sacred respite in the form of Latin Mass, incense, and a distant promise that if you behaved yourself long enough, maybe God would reward you with a better crop next season, though not likely. You'd be required to give 1/10 of everything you grew or earned, whether you could afford it or not. This was, of course, to support the very same church that offered no practical help during your weekly visits to the local healer. If you needed bread, the church would bless you. If you needed medicine, it would bless you and hope that you didn't get worse. Meanwhile, back at the manor, your Lord's steward, who was as devoid of compassion as he was of character, would come around regularly to remind you of the importance of paying your debts, maintaining your fealty, and not bothering the Lord unless you had something valuable to offer, such as a healthy goat or a decent suggestion for the harvest festival entertainment. The steward was also the official scribe for all things involving your financial misfortunes, keeping track of what you owed, what you didn't have, and how very little of it was useful. And yet, despite everything, there was always a strange, stubborn resilience. You might be starving, you might be drowning in debt, and you might even have a few broken bones from a particularly enthusiastic harvest, but you'd keep on going. Why? Because that was the only choice you had. If the land didn't kill you, the Lord would, and if neither of them did, then there was always the threat of the next plague. And with that, you soldiered on, just another cog in the vast and grinding machine of feudalism, keeping your head down, your hands busy, and your stomach quietly grumbling. But the wheel of fortune spins, my friend, and sooner or later the plague would come knocking, bringing a whole new set of problems that made rent, starvation, and lords seem like quaint historical footnotes. Plagues. Nature's population control with bonus pustules. If you were a medieval peasant, plagues were an old friend. One you never invited, never wanted, but always knew would drop by eventually. The plague had a particular fondness for hitting populations that were already a little bit run down. If there was a village with a population of 10, 5 of them already sick with something, and another 3 who hadn't seen a decent bath in a year, you could bet your last stale loaf of bread that the plague would swing by for a visit. It wasn't so much a matter of if you would get sick, but when. The plague wasn't about sneaky tactics or subtlety. It was like that one relative who shows up uninvited to every family reunion, clutching a box of cookies and bad news. In the case of the Black Death, the bad news wasn't in a whisper. It was in the form of swollen glands, fever, and, for the truly unlucky, a swift and grisly death. In medieval times, plagues were almost an annual tradition, akin to harvest festivals or the Lord's annual demand for rent. You'd get through the bad times, the famine, the constant hard labour, and then bam, plague, a nice little seasonal bonus. And the thing was, the medieval peasant knew it was coming. They didn't understand the bacteria or the blackened skin, but they knew that when certain things happened, you had to start preparing for death. There were signs. The rats started acting funny. The air smelled of decay, even before the bodies started piling up. The town priest would begin massing people into prayer circles with more vigour than a windmill on a stormy day. And the townspeople, being an optimistic bunch, would throw a bit of garlic on their doorposts and hope for the best. But secretly, everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The plague wasn't just one disease. Oh no, medieval life wasn't that simple. It was more like a buffet of death. You had your classic bubonic plague with its bulbous lumps and the distinct smell of death. Very exclusive, very VIP. Then there was the pneumonic plague, which was not unlike the bubonic, except that it involved coughing up blood and an exceedingly rapid demise. And if you were especially lucky, you could experience both simultaneously. The perfect storm of mortality that guaranteed your place in the annals of medieval history. For the peasants, plague wasn't just nature's way of getting rid of the weak. It was variety. And when the plague came, you had to do what any self-respecting peasant would do: panic. Of course, there was a hierarchy to how the panic unfolded. The wealthy and the powerful ran off to their country estates, leaving the rest to suffer. But the peasants, well, they weren't in the position to flee. They had neither the means nor the luxury of escape. They didn't even have proper roads to run on. Their panic was more of a group affair. It was collective, quiet, and grimly accepted. A few would pray. A few would try to make themselves useful by offering healing services, often in exchange for a token coin or two. Most, however, would just sit, wait, and cross their fingers that they weren't next in line for the hot breath of death. And like clockwork, the plague would do its rounds. It wasn't a quick death either. No, the medieval plague was an art form. It didn't rush. The symptoms were a slow build-up, a kind of foreplay of suffering before the grand finale of eternal sleep. The fever would arrive first, followed by a series of aches and pains that made even the hardiest peasant feel like they'd just been trampled by an angry ox. Then the buboes would appear, those lovely tender lumps in the armpits, groin or neck, a hallmark of a good quality plague infection. The peasants would touch these lumps, shake their heads, and try to go back to work as if the weather was the real problem. But despite the ravaging effects of the plague, there was a certain grim practicality that followed. You see, the medieval peasant's mindset wasn't focused on survival in the way we might think of it today. No, survival for them was simply about getting through the day. The plague was just another inconvenience, another wretched curse that would come, kill a few people, and leave the survivors wondering what to do with their ruined crops. Life continued after all, didn't it? And so, too, did death. In the aftermath of a plague, villages would often experience an eerie quiet. The fields would grow untended, the farms abandoned, and the roads empty. The local lord, if he was lucky, might get a bit of respite, as a good number of his serfs had been wiped out in the process. The empty land might have been seen as an opportunity for the remaining peasants to seize, but in practice it was more like a broken pot that no one wanted to pick up. Who would want to till the soil that had seen so much blood and suffering? But it wasn't all bad news. For those lucky enough to escape the worst of the plague, life had a way of picking up again. If enough peasants survived, things would eventually return to normal, at least as normal as things ever were in medieval times. But that didn't mean that the fear and suffering were forgotten. No, the plague left behind a legacy that stayed with peasants long after the last body was buried. It wasn't just the marks on their bodies, but the psychological marks that lingered. The survivors never quite got over the trauma of knowing that death could strike at any time without warning. And yet, in true peasant fashion, they adapted. They didn't have time for deep reflection or existential crises. They had crops to plant, if they could find seed, animals to tend, if they hadn't all died from some form of livestock plague, and lords to appease. The survivors would carry on, as they always did, because that's what peasants did. They survived. They got by, one plague at a time. In fact, if you were a medieval peasant, you'd probably develop a healthy or unhealthy sense of fatalism. What else could you do? As much as plague was a horrifying constant in the lives of the peasants, it was also something they had learned to live with. In a strange way, the plague became part of the rhythm of their lives, a rhythm that, like the cycles of planting and harvest, was as reliable as anything could be. There were years of plenty, and there were years of death. The one certainty in life was that you would see both, and that there was very little you could do to change it. If there's one thing medieval peasants knew how to do, it was to face death with a kind of stoic, albeit grim, acceptance. When the plague came calling, there was no grand battle. There were no valiant last stands or heroic moments. There was only the realization that nature had a penchant for thinning the herd. And the herd, while grumbling and muttering, simply accepted its fate. Because ultimately, what else could they do? You couldn't outrun the plague. It didn't care if you'd been a good peasant or not. It only cared about numbers. The more the merrier, or in this case, the fewer the better. And so, plague after plague, year after year, the medieval peasant endured. They would make do, they would survive, and they would go on to have children who would in turn do the same thing. Nature would keep cutting away at the weak, while the strong carried on, slightly thinner, a bit more jaundiced, and with just a hint of fear in their eyes. The eyes of those who knew, deep down, that it wasn't a matter of if, but when, the next plague would arrive. The peasant's ability to endure was extraordinary, but also rather depressing. It was a matter of sheer survival, not because they wanted to live in a world of disease and death, but because they didn't have any other options. And in the end, survival was the greatest victory they could hope for. Because in the medieval world, the true luxury wasn't in gold or land. It was in simply being alive long enough to see another year. The church will save you for a modest fee. Ah, the church, that towering beacon of spiritual hope, moral guidance, and of course, a rather convenient system of wealth accumulation. If you were a medieval peasant, your relationship with the church was, to put it mildly, complicated. You couldn't live with it, and you certainly couldn't live without it. The church was everywhere, and it would help you. For a small fee, naturally. First, let's talk about the basics. In a medieval village, the church was the centre of the social, moral, and financial universe. The local priest was the spiritual equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. He performed marriages, baptisms, and burials, served as the community's primary source of news, if you counted the latest gossip from the neighbouring village as news, and often acted as the intermediary between the peasants and the larger world, which they could barely comprehend. It was not an easy job, as the priest had to keep everyone on the straight and narrow, while keeping a straight face through all of it. It was, after all, hard to preach about piety when everyone in the pews smelled of animal dung and didn't exactly know the first thing about Latin. The church's role in medieval life was vast. There were the obvious religious duties, daily mass, sermons about hellfire and damnation, and the constant refrain that one must be pure of heart to enter the kingdom of heaven. For peasants, though, the church's most important service was its ability to provide absolution for sins, for a modest fee, of course. Confession was not about personal growth or spiritual enlightenment. It was more like a spiritual version of paying for a plumber to unclog your soul. You'd go in, confess a few minor transgressions, taking a turnip here, a little light theft there, and be given a penance that would probably involve more prayers than you could manage in a week. But no matter how much you messed up, for a small payment, you could secure your soul's place in heaven. If you were really lucky, you might even get a papal indulgence, which was essentially a VIP pass to the afterlife. And who doesn't love a good VIP pass, especially one that didn't come with any lines? The idea that the church was a spiritual saviour is of course largely true, but the other, less advertised aspect of the church was that it was also a financial institution. The church had a little thing called tithing, a process where peasants were expected to hand over a portion, typically 10%, of their already meagre income to the church. This was not a suggestion, this was a commandment. The reasoning behind it was simple. God needed money to run the place. After all, heaven didn't come cheap, and the upkeep of the church's opulent cathedrals, beautiful stained glass windows, and lavish vestments wasn't going to pay for itself. When peasants complained about how hard they worked just to survive, the church would gently remind them that their suffering on earth was necessary to guarantee a smooth ride to heaven. There were worse jobs, the priest would explain, like being in the purgatory queue forever. However, there were times when it felt like the church had a particularly sales-driven approach to salvation. If you happened to be sick, or if your crops failed, or if your family suffered some other calamity, and let's face it, calamity was a standard feature of medieval life, the church would offer you the chance to alleviate your suffering for a modest fee. If you had the money, you could buy candles, relics, and even special prayers, all of which promised to speed up your journey to divine grace. Some villagers became professional prayer buyers, going to the priest whenever something went wrong, purchasing an indulgence or two, and hoping that God would take pity on them. It was a nice little side business, really, and for the church, it was a steady stream of income. Of course, the real beauty of the system lay in the concept of penance. No matter how many mistakes you made, how many turnips you swiped, or cows you neglected, the church always had a way to make things right, at a price. The more egregious the sin, the larger the penance, but also the greater the opportunity for additional purchases. For instance, let's say you were a particularly bad peasant who had stolen a sheep, and maybe a little chicken for good measure. You'd confess your sins to the priest, and he'd assign you a penance. If you were in good standing, it might be a prayer or two, but if you were particularly unscrupulous, you could end up with a much bigger penance. And in those cases, the church would make sure you had all the right tools, holy water, relics, candles, and maybe even a pilgrimage to some faraway shrine, all of which could be conveniently purchased from the church, for a reasonable fee, of course. But the church wasn't just about selling forgiveness. No, the church had a monopoly on the afterlife. Peasants didn't really have a choice about whether or not to believe in heaven and hell, as the church had made sure that the idea of eternal damnation was so deeply ingrained that it became as much a part of life as scratching for lice. No one dared challenge the notion that if you didn't follow the teachings of the church, you were heading straight for the fiery pits of hell. Even if you didn't understand Latin, the idea of eternal suffering was universally understood, especially when it was accompanied by a few dramatic stories from the priest. There was another small but important aspect of medieval Christianity that peasants were made to embrace with grace and dignity: fasting. It was a regular part of the church's strategy to encourage piety through hunger. Lent, of course, was the most prominent time when peasants would sacrifice food for the sake of their souls. While it was true that they didn't have much food to begin with, this didn't make the process any less holy. The idea was that if you could deny yourself even the smallest comforts, like eating a few turnips or a rat you'd been eyeing for days, you'd earn divine favour. The fact that fasting made everyone even crankier than usual only added to the overall spiritual experience. Then there were the holy days, holy weeks really, that came with their own set of rituals. Some were for feasting, but most were for fasting or for giving money and goods to the church. And of course, the feast days were directly tied to religious figures like saints, and each village had its own patron saint. While the peasants didn't exactly get to pick which saint they wanted to honour, they did get to choose how much they'd contribute to the church's funds in the process. Each saint had their own story, and the more dramatic the saint's life, the more excuses for festivals, feasts, and, naturally, donations. Naturally, the church also had its own real estate business. Monasteries, convents, and large abbeys dotted the countryside, each of them receiving generous donations in exchange for the promise of a quick path to heaven. In fact, if you were a peasant with a little bit of savings, and by savings I mean a handful of dried beans, you could always invest your wealth in a local monastery, and rest assured that you were guaranteeing your own peaceful afterlife. The monastery didn't offer a refund, of course, but who needed a refund when you were guaranteeing your soul a golden ticket? Despite the church's wealth and influence, it also had its charm. There was something incredibly comforting about knowing that no matter how bad things got, whether it was the plague, famine, or an angry lord with a vendetta, the church had a way of assuring you that things could always be a little bit better for a fee. And for medieval peasants, this was a bit like the weather. Not entirely predictable, but always worth the investment in prayers and candles. And so, the medieval peasant learned to live with the church. It was a love-hate relationship, but like all relationships, it was just part of life. The church would save you, yes, but only if you had something to save in the first place. And even when you didn't, it was comforting to know that a candle or two, a prayer, and a little bit of money could buy you a better chance at heaven than a broken plough and a half-eaten turnip could.